I'm going to take you through the DrC's 6-step preliminary risk assessment. The risk assessment is preliminary because it may raise some risk factors that need further assessment and investigation. It's a good start and it's relatively easy to follow, so let's have a look and see how it works. First of all, we define our context of our risk assessment. This is really what are we just risk assessing. So we describe our background and our justification. So our background could be there's been some injuries, or maybe it's a new task. So we need to do some work with our team members to do the risk assessment on this new task, something along those lines. Scope. So our scope is what are we doing, where are we doing it, that sort of thing. So this is where we try and focus on a task or a facility or some sort of process. So we could put in here what is the actual task that we want to risk assess. So we're only going to look at the hazards associated with that scope. And our criteria, we set an acceptable level from number 1, which is very low, to 25, which is extremely high. So what is it that we're trying to achieve here? So we could put a range, maybe from 1 to 10 or 10 to 12, because they represent an improvement in the level of risk. Okay, so next we have a look at our hazards. We identify the hazards associated with this task that we've just described in our context. And this form has space for 5 hazards, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, over to the right. So you just write in there, in words, what those hazards are. Then, in our third step, you assign a consequence associated with that hazard. So, what is the consequence of this hazard during this task? Next, we have a look at the controls. So there's existing controls in almost everything that we're doing. How effective are those controls? So first of all, just list them down in this box here. Next, we have to have a think about the effect of those controls. So those controls will reduce the likelihood of the injury. So we have to consider on a scale of 1 to 5, as similar as we did with the consequence, how likely is an injury during this task, considering those controls. And then our risk score is found out by multiplying step 3 with step 5. And then you can compare that result with your criteria. Okay, so let's have a look in practice as an example. So in our example, our context is that we want to prevent slip, trip and fall injuries whilst walking on uneven ground. Okay, so already we've got a pretty good idea about what our risk assessment is going to be about. Our scope is workers to walk in harsh environments for several hours a day. Okay, so basic, easy to understand. We just write in there our scope. And we've set a criteria. In this case, it's very broad criteria between 1 and 10, low and medium. So maybe we just don't have a very good idea of how this is going to work out. But we set that criteria to keep our set of criteria so that we can compare that in our final step. So in identification, we've identified one of several hazards. Obviously you're going to have a look at some of the other hazards and you'll put them into here. But we've identified that there are some high temperatures associated with this task. If those high temperatures could have an effect of a serious injury of that worker. Okay, so we put in a number 4. There are some controls, so we've put down in here preparation, the individual is fit, clothing, water, two-way radio, and an emergency response. So it sounds like there's quite a lot going on here already to manage the risk of this high temperatures causing a serious injury. And so then that means that considering these controls, we've got a likelihood of 2. In other words, it's unlikely that an injury is going to happen. So we multiply 2 by 4 and we get an 8. And so our risk assessment risk score is 8. If we compare that to our criteria of between 1 and 10, we've actually come slightly below. So it's at the top end of that scale, so we could say there's definitely room for improvement, but we're below that risk score. So now have a go at completing the table for some other hazards associated with this task.